All right, this is a lecture where we're going to go very in-depth on epithelial tissues and both what they do and specific kinds of epithelial tissue. There'll be a separate lesson. It's not a formal lecture notes, but it will be a video that will review the different common types of epithelial combinations between layering and shape. And these are the most famous types of epithelial tissues, but we're going to look over the different slide examples of them as in a separate video, as well as review what kind of structures you want to look out for. Okay, so the key thing we're going to look over while doing this lecture is we're going to go over how the anatomical components of epithelial tissues allow them to do their physiological functions, right? Anatomy is the shape and location of things, and physiology is how things work. All right, so we're going to go over the intro. We're going to go over the two major ways we kind of define the function of epithelials or epithelium tissue. And then we're going to go over the major ways that they are layered, as well as how they're, and the shape of the cells that make up epithelial tissues. And finally, we'll go over a special kind of functional type of epithelial tissue called glandular tissues. So, epithelial tissues are the tissues that cover the outside of your body, and there's two main ways we define epithelial tissues based on their function. So epithelium is a type of epithelial tissues that cover your internal and external surfaces. But if you have epithelium or epithelial tissue that's capable of making stuff, secreting stuff, then we call it glandular, or we call the special structures they form glands. All right. So one of the key features of epithelial tissue is they're made of densely packed sheets of cells. So cells that are side by side, forming layers with no space between them. All right. So I'm going to kind of draw a quick sketch of what the way they typically lay out inside your body. So typically, you have your free surface, meaning the surface where there's no other organs or tissues. All right. And then the top layer, the layer of cells there is actually epithelial cells, and they're called the superficial or apical epithelium. And generally speaking, if it's facing the outside, especially the outside of your body, it's usually dead. And the reason why that is because those extra dead cells provide kind of protection for the cells beneath it. All right, below, generally speaking, not always, but a lot of the time, epithelial tissues contain more than one layer of epithelial cells. By the way, if you're wondering what the circles I'm drawing inside these cells are, they're the nuclei, the nucleus, okay? So there might be many layers, there might be 2 layers, it depends, but the layer that's closest to the lowest layer of cells of the epithelial tissue, we typically call that the what's known as the deep, right? Because it's more below the surface, the deep layer, also known as the basal layer, the layer that's closest to the base. And because this tissue is the one closest away from the surface, or closest to the connective tissue layer, this epithelial cell layer is always alive. While the top most superficial epithelial tissue layer may not necessarily be that case. And this is actually the layer that's actively dividing and growing if there's more than one layer of epithelial tissue in an area. Now below that is the connective tissue, and the connective tissue is actually often made of not just cells but fibers, also known as the matrix. But so I'm going to kind of represent the matrix with little squiggles to represent the fibers that kind of bind and create the connective tissue. And this is what we call the connective tissue, but it's also known as the basement membrane because it's the layer, the membrane at the base or below the epithelium, like a basement is below a house. Okay? So every epithelial tissue is found on the surface of every organ, every area of your body. And the thing that keeps that epithelial attached to that body part is the connective tissue basement membrane that sits beneath it. So here's another kind of ghetto sketch of that, just a heads up if you're curious on kind of the relationship between the epithelium compared to the connective tissue that's kind of attaching that epithelium to everything below it. All right, so we already talked about some of the anatomical features of the epithelium. It's closely packed cells found in sheets, and you should have a rough sketch of that thing I did of the epithelial tissues beneath this part. Now, a key feature of the epithelial tissues is that lower layer, that basal layer of epithelial, is capable of dividing very quick. So because it's protective, it needs to be able to regenerate and grow frequently and replace any cells that get worn away or damaged. So it is able to do a lot of mitosis and division. Another feature of these cells, and this C should be kind of dented in a little bit more, sorry about that. But another feature of these cells is because the cells are tightly packed, they actually don't have room for any blood flow. So, for example, your topmost skin layers are made of epithelial tissue, which is why you can sometimes get kind of a kind of crazy paper cut and have no bleeding. And that's because the top 20 to 30 layers of your skin is actually made of epithelial tissue and they have no blood in them. If you actually get bleeding when you get a cut, it's because you damage the connective tissue below the epithelial tissue. And these tissues only stay alive purely thanks to the connective tissue beneath it, because the connective tissue below it is not as densely packed, so there is room for blood flow in the connective tissue, but not the epithelial tissue. So diffusion, meaning the transport of materials from high concentration to low concentration, is what allows nutrition from the blood to eventually reach the epithelial tissues above in the surfaces, apical and basal surfaces above the connective tissue. So going back to that sketch earlier, so you can add this to the prior sketch, or you can just make a new sketch. We have our epithelial cells on the very surface, and we have our connective tissue below it. The connective tissue, because it's not woven as tightly, can sometimes have blood vessel with blood in it to help provide nutrients and pick up waste from the epithelial cells. And it's sitting right inside the connective tissue. So any nutrients that are needed can diffuse into the epithelial cells, and any waste that might be made can eventually diffuse or flow back to the blood slowly. If you forgot what diffusion is, like I said, it's the natural flow of things from high concentration to low concentration. So imagine a scent. It's very strong at its source, but eventually it'll waft and kind of fade as it wafts, but it'll waft to further out stretches. And that's the same way nutrients and waste will reach or leave the epithelial tissues into the blood vessel. This is just kind of a crappy example of how that is. So let's say you have nutrients in your blood vessels. It's going to eventually move into the epithelial tissues, and then let's say you have waste in those same cells, it'll eventually leave and get back into the blood vessel. Okay? All right. So, going into the rest of the notes, the purpose or the function or physiology of the epithelium, like it was mentioned in the prior notes, is to protect, absorb, transport, or exchange materials, and to secrete or form materials that it can release either into a blood or onto the surface of a body part. Secretions can include sweat, it can include tears, it can include saliva, it can include mucus. Those are all secretions. But it can also include hormones that you secrete into your blood, like adrenaline or estrogen or testosterone. So we've gone over the functions of epithelial tissues. Now let's go into some commonalities in how they're found in the body, particularly that they're always on the surface and that there's always connective tissue underneath of it, and its source of food is in the connective tissues coming from the blood vessels in the connective tissues. Now let's go over the specific cell types that you typically see in epithelial tissues. So there's two things we want to look at when we think about epithelial tissues. We want to think about how many layers they form, and we want to think about the shape of the cells that are in those layers. So I want you to kind of draw this chart under the types of layering arrangements in epithelial tissues. And we're going to go over 3 ways layers can be made. One is simple, one is stratified, and one is pseudostratified. The one that's most confusing to think about is called pseudostratified. Simple and stratified are pretty straightforward. Simple is just one single layer of cells. Stratified is 2 or more layers. And pseudostratified is one layer, but the way it lays out makes it look like more than one layer, even though there's still only one layer of cells. All right, so let's go over simple. So simple are one layer only. And because it's only one cell layer thick, it's usually capable of moving things in and out of that cell. So things can get into that layer and pass straight through it. So it's a really great layering if you're trying to transport materials or allow materials to diffuse and filter through something. So your blood vessels, for example, are made of a single layer of cells that allow stuff in your capillaries, which are the small blood vessels in your body, to seep into and feed nutrients and oxygen to the rest of your tissues. All right? Because there's one simple layer, they're capable, those cells are kind of there as like cheesecloth. It's just taking in stuff and letting stuff leave. So they're really good for absorbing, moving stuff in. And also for filtering. Filtering means letting, as stuff passes through, maybe not everything can pass through, but the stuff you want may pass through, like nutrients. And they're also really good at secretion. If you have one cell layer and it's then facing no other cell layers, it's facing an empty area, it's perfect to dump that stuff out. So if you're making tears, if you're making sweat, it can just dump it outside if it's one single layer, right onto the surface. Stratified is really good if you need protection, because more than one layer means you can have an apical surface with dead cells, and dead cells don't get hurt if they get damaged. They just disappear and you make more underneath of it. So your skin is the most famous type of stratified tissue, but anything in your body that you're like, ooh, that area of your body might be damaged a lot, will probably have a lot of stratified tissue. For example, your stomach, it has a lot of layers of stratified tissue because there's stomach acid and food churning through it that could damage the stomach walls. So you want it for protection. 2 or more layers, usually more than 2 layers. And finally, we have something called pseudostratified, which is a little bit confusing. So you see pseudostratified like in your trachea, sometimes in your intestines. The way I like to think of it is, have you ever seen those weird balloons on a car sales lot, the floppy balloons of the person that's kind of wiggling, dancing and wiggling back and forth in the wind, just kind of dancing around, and they're flopping over and they're just swishing back and forth. I'm very bad at drawing, but usually in a live lecture I dance it out. But basically you have a floppy balloon dude and he's dancing this way. The wind blows and now he's dancing this way and he's swaying this way. That's the way pseudostratified works. So this is one cell and it's flopping over to the right. And this is another cell and it's flopping over to the left. And because the cells are floppy, they end up accidentally making what appears to be layers. Even though there's only one cell here and one cell here and one cell here, because they flop over, they end up crossing each other occasionally, and then it ends up looking like more than one layer, even though this guy is actually just flopping over and ends up accidentally looking like a stratified 2 layers of cells when it's not actually that. And that's why it's called pseudostratified. So it's only one cell layer, but it's pseudo, it's fake stratified. Because these cells are flopping around and flipping back and forth, that means they're swaying a lot, which means these cells are usually really good in tissues where you're trying to move things across the surface. So you'll find it in your trachea, because your trachea is your windpipe, so you might need to cough things out or catch things in back of your throat and then cough it out or swallow it down. So it's really good for flowing, moving things across the surface and out or down into something else. All right, now let's go over the shapes of epithelial cells. So there's 3 or actually 4 main shapes of epithelial cells. So copy down this table. This table, you actually want quite a bit of space, or you want to be able to draw really small, okay? So if you draw really large, you might want to tilt your paper to the side. Otherwise, just kind of copy down this chart, but make sure you have a decent amount of space for characteristics and drawing. All right, so we're going to go over 4 tissue types. We're going to go over squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and transitional. I like them, most of them, because the names sound like what they should, like what their shapes are. All right, so the first shape we're going to go over is squamous. So squamous is, I like to think of as squashed, right? It's squashed. So it looks like pancakes or a fried egg from above. Cuboidal, cube. So it looks like a cube, a square. In reality, even though it's a cube, some of them actually end up making kind of a weird shape, and I'll show you later. Another one is called columnar. Looks like a column. Looks like a rectangle that's swaying back and forth. And finally, we have transitional. Transitional has transitions between round, irregular shapes and stuff like that. But they actually aren't very squashed looking. Some students think transitional looks like squashed. No. Squashed is more squamous. Okay, so let's go over squamous. So this is a drawing of a simple squamous layer. Stratified squamous is actually a really weird shape, and that's why you really need to go over the video of histology of squamous tissues, so you can of epithelial tissues, because you can kind of get familiar with what stratified squamous actually looks like. But again, remember squashed, and hopefully that'll help you remember what squamous is. So, squamous from the side view looks like this, but actually this looks almost like smooth muscle in a way. Transverse cut of squamous is like really irregular squash looking, and oftentimes it looks like, like many layers of squash cells from the side. All right, superior or above view, so top down, it looks kind of like a pancake or fried egg, sometimes people say. Cuboidal looks like cubes. Sometimes they have microvilli. If you don't know what microvilli are like tiny hairs that help provide additional sweeping across the surface of the cells, so they help brush things off and across. And sometimes they provide extra surface area for taking in stuff. So they're very good for absorption and secretion. So a big thing here is the fluffier and more volume a cell has, the more ability it has to take in stuff and make stuff. So you'll notice squamous is rarely ever going to be used for making stuff. But columnar and cuboidal, because they're rectangles or squares, because they have more volume, they're capable of making stuff. So absorbing, taking in stuff, and secreting. Making stuff for your body is done by cuboidal and columnar. Squamous is going to either be for protection, or if it's only one layer, it's going to be used for rapid diffusion. Okay? Diffusion meaning because it's so thin, stuff is able to pass through. If stratified, though, it's used for protection. It's actually the most common for protection if it's stratified. All right, moving on to the next two. So in this case here, this is what I mean for the superior view of squamous and fried egg. This is what that looks like. Okay, so let's go over the other two. So columnar. So columnar is a big column. They may be ciliated or have microvilli. So if you remember, cilia is, if you haven't learned that yet, it is an organelle hair projection. So it's an extension of the cell membrane that comes out of the cell, and that allows it to grab stuff more easily and also move and sweep stuff more easily. So again, it's very useful if you want more surface area to absorb and secrete stuff or to move stuff around. Transitional is transitional, meaning it transitions or changes shape throughout the many layers. Some students get confused with this with stratified squamous. So again, that histology video is going to be helpful for this. And in this case, the thing here is it changes shape when stretched. Now, changes shape when stretched doesn't mean it goes from round to squashed. It means it goes from kind of rounded surface to kind of flat surface. So if it's empty or relaxed, meaning it's smaller, it's going to be a little bit more round at its surface, like this at its surface. And if it's a bladder that's full, then its surface tends to look like more stretched out. Okay? So this is actually only found in the bladder. Nowhere else in your body has transitional tissues. It's the bladder because it's a surface area organ that's going to kind of get really big and then really small constantly as it fills up with urine and releases the urine. So this is kind of a picture of that phenomenon with transitional. But again, looking at those histology examples in the separate video will help you kind of get a feel for what those look like. So if you combine layering with the shape, you can come up with multiple types of epithelial tissues. But these are the most common kinds that we'll go over in the class. So simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar are really important. Pseudostratified columnar is another important one. Transitional is often referred to, and then we have stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar in addition to stratified squamous. So these are all cartoony pictures. What they actually look like under a microscope is very different. So again, using those histology slides that's for epithelial tissues, those are going to be very helpful as a reference in the future when you look at organ tissues and have to identify which parts are epithelial tissues and what's not epithelial tissues and what kinds they are. All right, finally, we're going to go over glandular tissues. So glandular tissues, are also sometimes known as glands, or the structures they form are known as glands. And there are special functional types of epithelial tissues that secrete materials. They're most often made of cuboidal or columnar cells. So the part that's making stuff, which is this purple part here, might be made of simple columnar or simple cuboidal tissues. Okay? Now, glands are named after where they dump their materials into. So if it's a gland that's next to a blood vessel and dumps its materials into the blood, like hormones, for example, insulin made by the pancreas, or adrenaline made on top of your kidneys, or testosterone made by your testes, or estrogen made by your ovaries. If those are all examples of what we call endocrine glands, endocrine glands, and they dump things into your body. Another way to think of it is endo sounds like enter, and when stuff enters your blood, it's able to go and enter throughout your body. Exocrine glands are glands that are located towards the surface of either your skin or inside the hollow of your organs. So like inside your nose or inside your throat, you can sometimes feel mucus there. That's being produced by exocrine glands. So exocrine glands dump their materials onto the surface of the epithelium. So in this case, they have a tube or duct from the part that's making stuff, and then that tube is allowing it to exit and go onto a surface. So things that they might make is waxes and oils to keep your skin soft or your hair soft, sweat, digestive enzymes like the stuff made in your saliva or the stomach acid, and enzymes you find in your intestines, and mucus. These are all examples of exocrine glands. So these is kind of a not great image. So I would kind of like to draw kind of a more cartoony image of exocrine versus endocrine gland. But again, exocrine glands are released onto the surfaces of your body, and endocrine glands are released into your blood. Okay? So in this case, one way to draw it is your gland part, and I'm actually going to color a different color here. Your gland part are a single layer, sometimes a double layer, of cuboidal or columnar cells. And they're creating materials and dumping them into this kind of hollow space here. And in this hollow, it can be released onto the surface, or it can be diffused into the blood over here when it goes from the hollow area. The duct here, the tube here that leads to the surface, is what allows the material to escape onto the surface. But there is no duct in the endocrine gland because that gland is right next to blood vessels, and it's just going to naturally diffuse or get absorbed into the blood. So one of the weird things is because cuboidal is often found in glands, which means they're wrapped inside a circle, it ends up meaning that when you look at cuboidal cells, they don't actually look like perfect squares. They look like this when you look at them in a microscope because they're pinching on each other as they get curved into a gland. So that's one of the weird things about the shape of simple cuboidal cells. Because they're so often found in glandular tissues, this is actually the more common image of a microscoped picture of a simple cuboidal cell tissue sample. All right, key takeaways. Epithelial tissues are tissues that line the outer surface of your body and organs, and they protect, and they can sometimes form a glandular tissue that secretes. Their layering determines whether they play a more protective role, which will always be the case for stratified, or whether they might play a role in something else, such as secretion or absorption or transport. In addition to that, cells with more volume, like cuboidal or columnar cells, are the main cells used for secretion, for making stuff and absorbing stuff. But if you want to transport and diffuse things through a layer really quick, you want to use squamous. That concludes the notes. Move on to any other work you have. Bye.